Hey everybody, it's Eric Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts.
Anne, it is awesome that I get to interview you.
It is awesome. We go way back.
We go way back. So everyone needs an origin story. And I know you have an amazing one, and I don't know if everyone really knows about your origin story. So maybe you could talk to the group a little bit about your origin story of how does someone like you go from Wall Street to genomics?
Yeah. So for me, it seems really obvious. So the beauty of Wall Street is it's kind of non-specific. You're just researching everything, and I would research xenotransplantation, I was looking at hospitals, I was looking at insurance companies. So I felt like I really got to know a lot about healthcare in general. But one of the areas I happened to be looking a lot at was genetics. So I was looking at human genome science, Affymetrix, Insight, Millennium, and was like fascinated by the power of genetics and what was happening, and the cost curve, and a lot of those companies were talking about like the potential of genetic-based medicine and the ability to find new therapies that had a human genetic component. It was going to really change drug discovery. And at the same time, the more I started getting into healthcare, I started realizing that like what was in my best interest wasn't really represented in the entire system. And I had a few really awful, it's kind of interesting. I've been watching the TV show Billions too, but it reminds me obviously of my Wall Street days. Like people sometimes say really awful things and they just are totally unaware. So I had this one hospital CEO and he was like, "Oh, we're seeing margin expansion. It's so great." He's like, "We just moved collections into the emergency department. So we get people on the gurney." He's like, "Oh, we go after them right away." And, people, even recently, we have a company that we work with that, the uninsured pay rack rate. So technically in this country, the poorest people in the country pay the most. And we were looking at direct pay options that would be cheaper. And then they finally backed out. And they're like, no, we realize that even though it's only 1% of our volume, it's 3% of our bottom line. And so even though there's a moral issue that they're charging people, the poorest people, the most because it's making money, they're not going to change it. And, we talked about this in the earlier session. One thing that I grew up with is a community of academics who were really passionate about what they did and really moral. People that can't be bought. And in some ways, the scariest people in the world are people who can't be bought because they're going to do what they want and they can't be pressured. They can't be purchased. They can't be swayed. And I feel like I have a little of that. I had a real moral bent. I wasn't interested in being on Wall Street just for the money. I was interested in being on Wall Street because I was really interested in healthcare. I thought I could deploy capital and I could drive incentives in the right way. And I was really disappointed that, in fact, I was helping propagate a system where, it was all about how do I monetize obesity in China? My sister studies obesity at UCSF, and she would talk about obesity in the coming crisis. And then I would give obesity, the ultimate money-making opportunity. And I remember people would look at me like I was totally evil. And even now, I sit on the board of Kaiser's Medical School, and I was showing them, I was like, "No, Fidelity has an obesity tracker." And they're like, "No." I'm like, "Yeah, they do. There's an ETF that just tracks obesity-related stocks." So the reality is I felt like there wasn't, no one makes money on keeping me healthy. And that really just felt awful. And I spent a lot of time investing in the HIV community in the late 90s. And I was really inspired by the activists. And I was also kind of inspired by these people who, in my mind, were really moral in mission. They were doing the right thing. They were disseminating information. They were storming the FDA. They were going after Glaxo. They were doing they were activists. They were out there. They had a mission. And I felt like the rest of the healthcare world, like we're all kind of like passive lambs. It's like communist society. We're all just there waiting for like Big Brother to tell us what to do. I was like, we need a way to activate people. And 23andMe really kind of came out of this idea that I want to activate people. I want to give a platform that's genuinely in the right interest of individuals. And what we all want is not necessarily how to like effectively, be medicated at 100, but you want to be healthy at 100. And I want to have a platform that's really going to do the right interest for individuals and give people a voice and not treat people like human subjects, but treat them like people and say like, hey, like we're all 99.5% the same. We all have this collective interest in health. Like, let us actually like share our common, background and like all try to be healthier together. And so 23andMe kind of came out of, in some ways, 10 years of experience of watching what I think is really bad. And in some ways, I feel like I use on a almost daily basis what I learned to make sure that we're like trying to use it in the right ways now at 23andMe.
Can you talk to us a little bit about those early brainstorming days? That was a time where, the idea of sequencing was still this kind of like, it's almost this aspirational science thing. And people, so I'm wondering, like, what were you writing on the whiteboard as you guys were thinking about this and trying to hone this into an active, crisp thing that could be executed against?
I have, it's fun. I have those pictures of our whiteboards. It's like one advantage of always taking pictures of stuff. In some ways, like maybe it was like this in the early computer days, like you can just see a vision. Like at some point, sequencing was going to be everywhere. It was just obvious. Like that was going to happen, and the cost curves were going to continue to go down. And it's like mirrors. Like your genome is like a digital representation of you. So at some point, it's going to be omnipresent. Like everyone's going to know their genetic information. It's going to happen. So what's really unusual about 23andMe is how much our Series A deck is similar to our Series F. Like a lot of companies change their vision over time and they iterate, and we've had to change parts of like, we originally said we're not regulated, and clearly we are, but we didn't change our mission. Like we're still direct to consumer. Like we didn't vary there. So in those early days, like some of the fundamentals have never changed. Like genetic information is really interesting to people, and it's a core technology, and it's going to get cheaper and cheaper over time. And the two big hypotheses we had were, will people share information about themselves online the same way they do Live Strong and Susan G. Komen? Like, will people come? Can we create a community? And the second thing is, like, can people accurately put their information in online? And because we get self-reported data. We have over 2 billion data points on our customers. And there was always this question. Like, people always said, like, oh, people can't self-report. I'm like, well, when I go to the doctor and I see the doctor and he asks me my family history, like, what do you think I do? I self-report. So it was kind of like, there's, like, again, the one thing I learned in healthcare is all this paternalism and all these assumptions about how utterly incapable you are. And it's one thing, again, I learned, like, people are actually much more capable than we ever expected. So those were like the big hypotheses that we had out there, but we always knew social, like Web 2.0 was coming. It was like social was coming, and the technology curve was coming. Like, I think my presentation pitch was like purely just like Moore's law plus Live Strong plus like Flickr, and like we raised money. Like, I mean, just kind of on that concept.
When you talk to these investors, you guys were really the first ones out there, if I recall. And so you have a whole bunch of investors who are still just, social media at that point. LinkedIn is just starting.
Yeah.
It's still a MySpace world.
Totally.
Facebook's not there. And so that's the era. How did the investors kind of get their head around this? Or how did you get their head around it? Given that it's such a paradigm shift, and they probably don't know any of the biology or the other aspects.
I think investors, again, part of it was the chat, like, because I come from the investor world, I kind of know, or I have this knowledge, like, at least that all my peers. I was like, I'm not raising money from any of my peers. I would never want them involved because they don't really, like, their incentives are to make money. Like, they don't really know anything. So finding the right investors was always really hard. It was a hard priority for us. We're lucky. We got Patrick Chung from NEA. In some ways, like, he didn't totally understand everything, but he heard the pitch and he wrote a check 24 hours later. And it's one of those things, like, it's like dating. You never grovel with your date, like, oh, please go out with me again, please. Investors, you should have the same approach. If it's not the right fit, like, I'll be in a meeting sometimes and I see them asking questions and I'm like, oh, no, we're done. Like, no, you don't get it. And we went through it, like, we took a bunch of meetings, and people don't understand necessarily, like, healthcare. People are, again, a lot of, especially traditional healthcare investors, are really pessimistic about the potential of the consumer. And then a lot of consumer people and tech people are like, what is this healthcare? It's regulated. Like, I remember Larry Page coming out once and saying, like, healthcare is awful. It's, like, regulated. I never want to get in it. So we had a hard time finding the right investors. We got a lot of really great seed investors, like people like Richard Branson, who, didn't really know anything, but was like, I don't know, it sounds crazy and cool. And I think people who, in general, are just interested in, like, there's going to be a radical change at some point in healthcare and technology. And it's, in some ways, we had one investor, too, who invested in us, and then he clearly didn't fully get it, and then 6 months later invested in a competitive company. And we were like, you can't do that. And he's like, well, we did. I was like, well, you have to take your money back then. And they actually did. So we gave them back their $1 million in their Series A. But I was like, I kind of ran a hard line. Like, you have to be a supportive investor. But it's really hard sometimes finding people who can get your idea, especially when it's more out there. And the only thing you can do is, like, you keep going and you keep trying. Like Sequoia, we met with Sequoia a bunch of times. They were awful, and they invested in our last round. And I went into the meeting. I was like, I just want to lay it on the table. You guys were awful, and I'm only here kicking and screaming. And like, I think I'm a huge, like, one of my other philosophies. And Carrie's in the back. She can vouch for this. I'm a huge fan of being transparent. Like, someone asked me, they're like, oh, like, I never have to prepare for media. I don't have to prepare for much because, like, I always say what's on my mind. Like, it's so obvious. I never lie. I never say anything. I never, like, try to, like, oh, well, how am I going to, like, frame this in the right way? Like, no. People always know how I stand. And so with the investors, it's, like, also kind of similar. Where I was like, no, this is what we're going to do. And
so how does that, especially for all the founders and others that are listening to this, as they think about, we have that kind of founder story of, like, inspiration, and then it was just a hockey stick. Here it's easy to look at it retrospectively of all the success that's happened for you and the company, but it hasn't always been a rocket ship. Healthcare is hard. You guys went toe to toe with the FDA. You've kind of seen all these different challenges, and you've kind of dealt with them one at a time. What's the advice that you have for people as you kind of look back and through that lens of, you're dealing with healthcare and you're dealing with regulations where there's all sorts of complexity. People don't necessarily understand you. They come with alternative agendas. There's others who have alternative agendas that influence them. What's the advice to stay strong and keep powering through that?
I think, we've been successful of late, but I still feel like we have so much more to do. So we had, the first 10 years or 9 years of the company, it was a slog. And, in some ways, like, when you have a mission and you really care, like, you don't care about it being hard. And I remember even when we had our FDA shutdown, I had someone, a regulatory advisor at one of our investors. She was at a big with a pharma company. She's like, Anne, you have two choices. One, you can, like, go and you can hack it together. You can, like, figure out a way to circumvent it, and you can sell the company. But if you really want to change the system, you just put your head down and you do the hard work. Like, you figure out how to get this approved as a direct-to-consumer. And that is how you're fundamentally going to change the system. And the one thing I can see now in retrospect is that there's something about really sticking to something. And I remember in the early days, we were randomly at this dinner with the U2 band after a concert, and Bono sang. He's like, the reason, someone was asking, why are you successful? He said, the reason why we're successful is in part because we've stuck together and we work through our conflict. And he's like, beauty really comes out of conflict and resolving it. And it always kind of stuck with me as like that there's something about like sticking it out and not giving up. And people always ask, like, oh, didn't you think about folding the company at some point? And I remember one of my senior people in the company at the time of the FDA letter was like, Anne, you know most companies just like fold up at this time. And it never occurred to me. I was like, it was kind of to me, I was like, you're such a wimp. Like what, like a little conflict? You can't handle a little conflict? So, there's always a solution. And part of it is, there's two aspects. Like one is recognizing like when you should give up. Because like we definitely, like we have projects in-house all the time where we start a project, you try it for a while, and at some point you're like, wow, this is like a failure and it's going to sink. But then there's other times where you just recognize, like for us, something like an FDA, the warning letter we had, like this is workable. But you just like, it's hard. And there's a lot of stuff, like Silicon Valley has a little bit of the mentality, especially outside of the healthcare space, where it's like, oh, Instagram, WhatsApp, you can make money so fast. Like nothing happens quickly in healthcare. And it is a slog. But if you really want to change it, again, I think the thing that motivates people in this building is the mission. And it takes a long time.
How do you convince people, not of the mission, but that, we're sitting in this, they walk down the street, they see their friends, they see the quick payouts, they're in the slog, you question mission sometimes. Yeah. How do you get your team to stay focused on the mission? And how do you also attract people that, to your point, that can't be bought? How do you test for that? How do you get that notion in there?
I think it's through the actions of the company. Like, I think it's things that we, everyone has a story of their own health, like that resonates with people. And, like one of the things that we try to let people do, like in those early days, we would let people like run their own research studies. Like, so like my general counsel, her father had a disease, and like we ran a whole research study kind of like based on that. Like we did things, we give a lot of data away to academic collaborators as well. So we kind of try to encourage people, to be able to pursue some of the interests that they really want. I think one of the things culturally, like culture is really important. And it's hard to ever specifically define culture. But like one thing that's really important here is like we treat people like adults. Like the same way I want to treat my customers, I think we try to treat people well. And, like part of it is that like you treat people, you don't micromanage. You don't try to like micromanage their hours. You don't try to like second guess everything. And your actions like stay really focused. Like I think we demonstrate continuously through decisions about the mission. And I think in some ways, like one of the ways that you demonstrate your dedication to the mission is through controversy. Like we demonstrated our commitment to the direct-to-consumer pathway through the FDA shutdown. Like we could have easily changed and said, no, we'll be an LDT and we'll be physician ordered or we'll be back on the market really quickly. And we chose not to do that. So I think that those types of things attract people. I also think for the right kind of person, like when you ask like what the people who can't be bought, those are people who like hard problems. They're people who are they're not looking to make a quick buck. Like they're interested in like a challenge. Like I say all the time, like one thing, like we have, the world's largest, group of people who are genetically high risk for Alzheimer's. It's a really interesting problem. Like what should we do? We have lots of people who are, 40, 50. How do we actually think about running a study to see whether or not we can do any kind of behavioral interventions that think about prevention? And I think one thing that also encourages people is like we kind of like everyone has crazy ideas and we encourage them. And I have times where, it can be someone on the customer care team or like a junior engineer, and they bring up an idea and they flag something that they don't like in the company, or they have an idea on something, and that changes the course of the company. And so I think also things like that too, that like you have to demonstrate everything through actions of like, wow, like people really believe that they're empowered. And, someone can be sick, or a family member, or people have kids, like, we give fertility benefits, we give 6 weeks of paternity leave. Like, we try to like walk the walk. Like, we have an organic local chef, because I feel like, I'm sitting here telling you how important it is to be healthy. So we have a trainer and we have food, like, because I believe, like, I'm telling all my customers, like, it's important what you eat and how you exercise. And so we walk the walk. So I think it's important to think about these things as like every single day, your actions reflect your culture and whether or not people believe you. And at any moment in time, people can stop believing you.
Let's switch gears a little bit to where things are going in the space. So we got to really know each other just before I went into the administration. We might have been hiking, and I led you down a path with a lot of poison oak.
I did get poison oak. Thank you. We did a study then on poison oak because we're actually analyzing the data now, whether or not some people are genetically more susceptible. But it's hard to define whether or not you were ever exposed. And people don't want to come in for a study where we like rub them with poison oak. I'm not sure I don't know, maybe the IRB would probably be fine with that. Anyways.
The IRB benefits if they're going out hiking. So one of the things that I've always appreciated about you is, especially as, when we had a chance to work on precision medicine, and you really influenced my thinking, is that you were almost always 2 to 3 steps ahead of seeing how the field is going to play out. And so how do you see the field playing out with the notion of genomic and tailored medicine?
I'm actually less focused on genomic and tailored medicine because I think like that's a 10-year haul. So we started, like in part, we do partnerships with most pharma companies, and we did partnerships in part, we're doing partnerships with pharma companies to show that we could actually help them with their drug discovery. But there was so much resistance and so much skepticism and like constant like questioning, like, is like you don't have the full genome and like self-reported data, and can we really trust this? And I don't know, is it really going to benefit? So we said, like, screw you, we're going to start our own drug discovery company, and we hired Richard Scheller from Genentech, and we now have 13 drugs in early and late stage development, or in early and late stage research, and we have specifically the goal, like, can I show that by starting with a human genetic foundation, I can do drug discovery with a higher success rate and more efficiently than the rest of the industry. So this is kind of a perfect example of patience, because this is not something that I can say, like, oh, next year I'm going to prove it out. Like, until I have, like, 5 drugs on the market, I can't really make a lot of claims. So this is, like, in 10 years. So I believe I have a very valid hypothesis that I can make, I can have more successful drug discovery than the rest of the industry, but I don't have the data yet to prove that. What I find really interesting right now, I kind of look at the company as 3 divisions. We're not separated this way at all, but mentally I think about it. So I have drug discovery, I have my consumer division, and then I have prevention. And there's a whole world. We have 7 million customers. And there's a whole world about thinking, like, people get their genetic information. I can tell you you're high risk for type 2 diabetes or, Alzheimer's. Like, what can I now do to help you actually be healthier? And so that's where I actually see this world that's happening now of digital therapeutics and digital phenotyping on your phone. That's kind of amazing. Because in some ways, I feel like we're not at this point yet, but we're going to flip from like diagnostics being in your physician office as the gold standard to that being like awful, because you can get so much data on your phone. Like, I can track your sleep, I can track your movement, I could track your eyes, like I could do hearing tests. Like, you can kind of measure everything with your phone. And so I'm not positive, like, when you go into the doctor's office and they do a series of cognitive tests, like one time, like, you're going to get so much more information off tracking people through their phone. So I think there's a phenomenal world about digital phenotyping that's coming. And I think the other reality is that healthcare today is this episodic experience of like, you go to your doctor once a year and like they tell you something and sometimes you remember, sometimes you don't. Your primary care is going to be on your phone. Like, why do you ever need to go in to your doctor? Like, if your child has a fever, why not call the company Heal and they come to your house for $99? And there's this other company I met then that will like look at like all the sort of socioeconomic factors. Like if you're on a diuretic and your bedroom's above stairs and your bathroom's downstairs, like, well, like maybe you're going to have a fall risk because you're going like, there's so many other parts of healthcare other than just the diagnosis. So I think there's an amazing world that's coming and none of it is predicated necessarily on being in the clinic. So I'm most excited about that potential.
So let's take that another dimension because we're living in a global world, and we've seen the race of countries like China trying to, we started put 20 million in for precision medicine. They're like, great, we'll put 9 billion. We've seen them run
Love
with
China.
They're like, we got the AI report we put out. They're like, great, thank you, and we're going to invest like everything we can. So in this race to drug discovery and all these things, I almost look at it, and correct me if this was wrong, is almost like you're in a race that isn't just U.S.-centric. You are in a very multinational race, and your competitors are bringing not just dollars from venture, they're bringing state resources. Yeah. How does this play out? And obviously there's an ethics question in there, not only for cybersecurity, but CRISPR and all the other activities. But I'm just like, if we just kind of relegate that to the playing field of how does this play out with different countries playing in the direct line of 23andMe, how does that look to you overall?
I do worry most about China, in part because I feel like they don't necessarily play by a lot of the rules, and they don't play by the rules, they have obedience, and they have money. So, like, my sister, she's living in Japan right now, and she just called me, and she was like, I heard about a program where, like, all school children in Shanghai are mandated to, like, spit and be in a genetics testing study, and I mean, there's just, like, stuff that, like, that would never happen here. So I think that there's a race in informatics on genetics, and, this country is definitely not winning it. And, the government, I mean, I think that's where you have somewhat of a disconnect. It's almost like, again, Tesla or Elon Musk with SpaceX and NASA. Like when I look at NIH trying to get their million genome program off the ground, like it's just inept. So, we're at 7 million. We'll be much bigger. Like we'll be able to grow much faster. But I do worry about countries like China and what is definitely feasible. So the thing that they can do is they can drive incredible amounts of scale, and they can drive incredible amounts of insights. And I was part of this Jason's talk, which is like the little secret DoD group, and they had this report on genomics like 10 years ago that was declassified, and it was all about like China getting into the genetics space and how they're going to stratify their armies and send certain people up into Tibet who are less likely to have altitude sickness than other people. So like very clear use cases. So I do think that there's like a whole world of like, how is this information going to be used? And there needs to be a robust discussion around it. And I feel like right now in the United States, we fight about turf wars. So I don't worry as much on drug discovery because, again, drug discovery, China's not known for their drug discovery prowess. Like I think they could always do something. They could definitely do more in diagnostics. So drug discovery I don't worry as much about, but I do think that there's, some kind of undefined advantage of understanding what the human genome means and then leveraging that to an advantage. And again, like when I think about it, it's like to me, there's that movie about them breaking the code in World War II. Oh, yeah. What's it called?
It's a story of Bletchley Park and Alan Turing.
Yeah, Turing. Uh-huh. So I think about the genome like that. Like there's a race going on, and like we want to decipher this code. And China, like we have some advantage. Like technically, the UK with Glaxo or like the Wellcome Trust and the United States with all of our human genome, like we were winning. We were like really leading it. And we're totally like tripping over ourselves right now. And I think that there's a race on like understanding it. I think it's so fascinating what's going to come of big data. And I think China has a huge advantage because they have a lot of people that they've hired who understand big data. I mean, you look at Baidu and the companies.
No GDPR.
There's no GDPR. And like I said, they have compliance and they have money. So my hope is like the United States, like it's part of the reason why I feel like, again, a moral responsibility. We need to make sure that people have access to like helping decipher and understand the whole, all the information that we're collecting and like help to mine it and understand like really what is it. Again, I always tell my kids, I'm like, there's a fine line between you and a slug, because like literally because like you have the same DNA, and but clearly you come out quite different. So I think it's a big race, and I think it's an issue that like it's so underfunded right now in this country.
I want to ask you, if you were czar of, all healthcare policy. So you're in control of 1/5 of the U.S. economy as a result. And you had a magic wand, but you have 1 day. You only get 1 day to do something.
I would make a single-payer system.
Single-payer system.
Single-payer system.
Say more.
I think you just have all the wrong incentives right now because you don't make money on cost savings. Like honestly, it was the group that taught me about prevention is Kaiser. I was a Kaiser baby. I felt like my Kaiser team, they are the ones who. They used to send out a book called Healthways, and it was all about how to take care of yourself and prevent. And my pediatrician, who's still a good friend, who I still see, and, he's the one who would sit me down and be like, this is how you know when you're sick. This is how you know when to go. I always knew the nurses on the advice line. Like, they were, like, very much about teaching. I had this one example, actually, with my daughter. We were sick, and we were in Fiji, and I wasn't sure if she potentially had meningitis. And I called my pediatrician, who's part of Stanford, who's concierge, and she was like, I don't know, Anne, your symptoms are mixed. You should probably come home. And then I called Kaiser, and she's like, you're like the 50th person this hour. It's the flu, lady. Go home. And I didn't go home. And, it's kind of also a good story of data. Like, it was really valuable to get lots of data. It's like one of those things, like people at Stanford, like if you're a VIP, you actually never really want the VIP treatment because it's worse. Like people, when like you're cordoned off in like a separate section, like you want what everyone else gets.
Out of touch with reality.
Yeah, I mean, we had a friend who was an oncologist at Stanford, and he was in the VIP after a surgery, and because he was VIP, he wasn't getting as regular care, and he ended up like choking and suffocating, had brain damage, and he can no longer work. But it was like literally all because he wasn't in the central space. So there's a lot of things about, you don't necessarily want to always have that exclusivity. So for me, again, if I was the czar, I think the most important thing that you could do is single-payer system and unify everyone on one plan, and you drive incentives like in that capacity. If the government was the single-payer system here, you would have an incentive to prevent people from being obese and diabetic. And those two things alone would dramatically change this country.
Great. Let's open it up for questions.
Hi, I'm Jin. I'm a child psychologist, and I'm founder of a company called Baby Noggin. Fascinated by your notion about digital phenotyping. So I just want you to explain a bit more about where you're seeing digital phenotyping maybe within 23andMe and how that will change.
Well, I think we'll be able to do things like we're going to start collecting steps. We're collecting some step data now. You'll be able to collect sleep. We're collecting hearing. We have cognitive tools. So cognitive tools are a pretty interesting measure. Like if you can get people to do a cognitive tool, like these 5 games every single year. So I'm 45 now. If I can do it for the next 20 years, I assume at some point the company will be able to pick up, like, okay, is there a cognitive decline? And then is there something, like the hope here is then, like, is there something you could do or early intervention? And that's actually what we hear. Like we had somebody who just wrote in the other day about how his mother is homozygous for the Alzheimer's variants. And as the moment she started having symptoms, they got her into treatment. She started therapy. Like, does early intervention make a difference? And I would think that would. So digital phenotyping, like I think cognitive is going to be one of the main ones. Like even how you tap on your phone, there's a good amount of data about that. Google purchased like one of these forks that you can use in Parkinson's that measures your vibrations, or how much shaking. So I think there's a lot. There's another company that was bought by another sort of health conglomerate that measures the stress in your voice. And I kind of love this because they would show when you'd get a call, and they'd be like, look, your mother is calling. The last 5 calls, you were agitated. And so, and then it would try to coach you, like, are you agitated again? Do you want to, like, change? So it's really interesting. Like, stress is one of those things, like, it's not well defined in this country either. And, you're going to be able to learn stress through your phone.
How do you think about that when we extend that to the employer and these concerns that are coming up around privacy with employers?
I utterly, like, one of my other drives, like, healthcare should not be through your employer. Like, I find it crazy. Like, if you leave 23andMe and you lose, like we offer certain types of benefits, and all these companies like Red Brick and Omada and Grand Rounds, they only sell through employers. Like, I don't know, like, why is my access to these services dependent upon where I work? I think it's crazy. And so, like, we're trying to, like, it's one of the things that we're trying to do when we have scale is, like, allow a marketplace so that people can just get these things. We're really trying to create an entirely different system that's not dependent on your employer. And I think, like, people should utterly, the same way, like, if you have, like, I'm an aggressive parker, and I, like, slightly overparked it, and it pulled off my whole bumper. And they're like, oh, you probably don't want to report this to the insurance. I'm like, no, of course I don't want to report it to my insurance. Like, we're all used to that from a car perspective. And so you want to do the same thing in healthcare.
I have the flu. I don't want to report it to my insurance.
The reality is, like, there should be a whole world that's, like, again, outside the healthcare system. Like, the majority, like, all of us, like, most of us, you don't need to go for, like, a sore throat, like, a lot of the basics. Like, why are we, like, going in this, like, awful system? And when you have, like, a real specialty and a real need, yes, like, then you want to be triaged in the right way. But a lot of care even can be at home and stuff. So,
great. Other questions?
Thank you. I'm Ali with a venture capital firm called Data Collective, DCVC. So you mentioned the single-payer health at one part, and you are a direct-to-consumer healthcare company, and basically mentioned, or we are seeing more direct-to-consumer. How do you see these kind of working together, or if you have more employer-based or government-based healthcare, how do you think that affects innovation on the direct-to-consumer health?
I think that it's one thing I learned when I was investing in India is that, like, there was a really robust direct-to-consumer market. Part of it is, like, people are 100% used to the idea that your employer or your insurer should pay for everything. So we have to retrain people in some ways to say, like, you should pay for some of it. So people are used to that with, like, plastic surgery and fertility and stuff like that. But you should pay more. There should be 2 systems. You should have 100%. You should have, like, your single payer system that provides your care and the critical and that guidance. And then you should absolutely have a direct to consumer where there's some things that you are just, you want to do on your own.
Isn't there a challenge to riff on that for a second? Because, like, I remember Grand Rounds when it was starting the first time, and I was just helping them out a little bit, and it was called Second Opinions. And we went to people and we said, hey, you should get the second opinion. And they were like, well, you make it almost nearly free, and they're like, well, I don't want to second guess my doctor, to all the other reasons. And you end up forced as a business model to turn into selling to the employer. So,
but that goes to your question about, like, the long term, like the hockey stick. Like, it's like sticking to your guns. Like, I'm always disappointed. Like, I always tell Grand Rounds, and all of them, like, continue having a direct-to-consumer option and have your employer option too, but don't give up, because, like, the only way you're going to change the world, like, it takes time. Like, I remember we had our big launch. Like, I always tell people in the company, like, we had our big launch. We had, like, all these celebrities. It was accidentally during Fashion Week, and, like, it was, like, Barry Diller and Rupert Murdoch and, like, all these people hosting this big, like, we were front page of the style section. We were Time Invention of the Year. And I was selling 15 to 20 kits a day. Like, it was awful. And we sold that many for years. Like, our volume, like, you look at our curve, like, right now our curve is still opposite. Like, the hockey stick looks like the first 9 years, and then it started to take off. But if you want to change, you got to stick to it. And like I look at all these companies out there that just like go to the employer pathway, and it's like death by 1,000 cuts, that pathway. But like I think you should have two versions. And like try to keep one, because like the consumer, and that's what we're, again, and I understand the pain of those companies. Like we're trying to say like we'll have a platform that will be big enough that will help support. Like if Grand Rounds can come on and say, listen, second opinions, here's the value of it. Like most people also don't understand the value of second opinions. Like I do think like New York Times had a great article a couple days ago about like a second opinion of this woman whose husband and was like they thought he was going to have all kinds of problems, and she's the one who figured it out, and she got a second opinion. There's all kinds of like I do think like the major press is trying to put more of those types of stories out there, and I think that that's one thing you learn in the community and like getting people to talk about those stories, but you have to educate people. And it is not easy. Like, I think about this as like, this is our next decade. Have to get people to think about, like, you actually have to take more control of your health. And, like, you can't necessarily rely on your doctor. Like, one of the main things that we try to push on people is, like, the one-to-one relationship with your doctor is no longer the gold standard. Most people in this country don't have a primary care physician.
How do you, like, we're living in an area that also has an incredibly high rate of people who don't believe in vaccines. I'm just curious because it's on one side we try to tell people, like, don't trust, but there's this other side where we're like, whoa, really?
Yeah, I think there's things, it's when again, I remind, like, my research team all the time, like, one of the most important things for us is, like, to be fun and to get people to believe and be, like, excited about our data, but never deviate from the science. Like, we're hardcore in the science. It's like little things even. Like, I just wrote, like, there's this awful New York Times editorial about us, and we just got our rebuttal published. And they came back and they were trying to trip me up. They're like, do you have the sources of your data? And I was like, yeah. And like 5 minutes later, we sent it back. And she was really surprised. She's like, oh, most companies don't have their sources. And I was like, yeah, like, we're really good people. Like, we're really, like, we are on it. And so, I like to remind people, like, Gwyneth Paltrow is, like, really popular with Goop. And she's, like, out there pushing all kinds of things. So when I go to my research team, I was like, your competition is Gwyneth. Like, you need to be as fun as Gwyneth. Like, she knows how to market. She knows how to get stuff out there. And, like, no one is researching the CDC's website and, like, their vaccine schedules, but, like, everyone's reading, like, Gwyneth, and there's the other, like, porn star anti-vaccine person who's, like, I mean, it's fascinating to me that people would rather believe, like, a celebrity with no science background than somebody with a science background. So there's a total crisis in scientific education. And I think in some ways it goes to your point about, like, oh, I don't want to challenge my doctor. Like, in some ways we've kind of been taught to be lambs. Like, we don't really trust, but we also don't know how to challenge. And then when Gwyneth, who's, like, kind of more fun and cool, like, challenges, you're like, oh, follow Gwyneth. So I think that's where there's like a big education. Like, what's the right way to challenge? What's the right way to look at scientific information? Like, what's a real risk? And there's a huge, I mean, again, this is a massive challenge of, like, how do you educate people? And, like, one of the worst things the healthcare industry does is, like, we tell people that you are too incompetent to possibly know. Like, even, like, when I went to the doctor in the pregnancy and they're like, oh, you have to do this blood test. And I was like, well, why? You just do. It's.
What do you mean, why?
He's like, well, it's going to tell you, about risk. I'm like, what? And, like, it literally, like, it was like torture, finally figuring out the formula and realizing, like, okay, there's the ultrasound and then there's the blood test. And the blood test really adds almost no value. But,
or
like,
amnio, when they say, like, because they try to say sell you on the downs thing, and you're like, look, you can just work out the Bayes theorem. And, and it's just like, that's not a good decision in many cases.
Right. There's a lot of healthcare that is just sort of blindly passed down. And that's one thing, like, we should do a better job of helping people understand and explain. And again, like, that's what I really got from Kaiser. Like, my doctors always explain. They never talk down to me. I remember being, like, 7 and being like, why do I have to do this? Like, what is this? And they always explained. It was great. It was an amazing experience. But, like, you want to teach people how to take care of themselves and, like, how these things work and how your body works.
I'm Christina LaMontagne with J&J Health Technology. I was really interested to hear about the drug discovery ideas, and we talked about how healthcare needs to be disrupted. Probably pharma needs to be disrupted as well. So if you're taking your data, using that to power drug discovery, what can you do from there in terms of maybe knowing the people who use the drugs, making adherence potentially better, compliance? Where do you go once you've proven the thesis around drug discovery?
Totally. So I think that's a ways off still. So it's like 10 years out. We are doing a lot of programs now with with pharma companies. Like J&J was actually our Series C lead investor. But we're doing a lot around clinical trials. And like clinical trials are an awful experience. Like you're a human subject. And you're brought in, everything is taken from you. They don't return any results to you. And then they're going to charge you a ton if the drug works. That's awful. Like there's no other company, like there's no consumer company that would ever do anything like that. So like part of it is, I mean, it's kind of fascinating. Like when I talk to pharma companies and like someone said, they're like, I said something, I was like, you have no relationship with your customers. And they're like, that's not true. We hear from them all the time. I was like, well, do you write back? And he's like, oh, well, and I was like, no, like it's a relationship is called two ways. Like it's got to be both. It's bidirectional. So I think it's like one of the things like with pharma, like there's stuff pharma could do now, and it's so sad because they have the worst reputation. And, you know, again, I kind of like we have this clinical trial stuff. We're doing work there. We've given up in some areas where it's like it's really hard. I've been really impressed with GSK, and it's the reason why we partnered with them. And I think there's a real potential for starting to change. So I would say like one of the first things like pharma companies need to first and foremost like return results, have a different approach in a clinical trial, treat people like a patient or treat people like a partner. Like, give them that dignity of, like, knowing what happened in the study. Give them the dignity of saying, like, okay, now you can get your drugs at cost. You're in the study, like, you get something out of it. It's really, like, we really treat people badly in healthcare. And so, like, it's no wonder. Like, no one ever wants to be a human subject. Just, like, change that word for one.
So it's actually something that strikes me as really interesting is I've always thought of as your approach and 23andMe is really, you're almost this community activist and community organizer for people to come together to talk about these problems. And it actually gets to this last part, because if I don't get here out here in a couple minutes, I have childcare duty. And my wife is here also, and so she will insist that I will...
You should have brought them.
I should
have. You could have grilled them.
My daughter also has a 23andMe backpack that Anne sent us, and it is her favorite thing ever.
It's actually amazing because we sent these backpacks to a lot of people, but almost everyone gave it to their teenagers, and they glow. They're 100% reflective.
That's amazing.
And so that's...
So here's the question, and this gets to 23andMe part. You're bringing the village together. And 23andMe is the platform by which it's happening in a unique way that's different than healthcare. It takes all of us a village, and this is one of the village questions that is always asked when in these type of events, as for the luminaries, is you didn't get here without a village. Tell us about one person who was super influential to you in your effort that made you who you are.
It's hard to pick one. I'm super lucky because like I'm surrounded by a family and I'm surrounded by people who've been really, really nice to me. And in some ways, it's like one of the things I've always said is that there's men, there's women, and there's assholes, and you should just avoid the assholes. And they come in all flavors. So I've been really lucky because I think I've been able to sort of target and find the right people to interact with. And again, I have my family. My sister, who's the CEO of YouTube, has always been incredibly helpful. I look at people like Diane von Furstenberg, and Ariana Huffington, and this other guy who used to be the head of the Motion Picture Association, who like I can't even remember his name, but he was just like so nice and like really just gave a lot of advice. Like people who almost like, again, they're sort of esteemed, like, famous people who believe in you. And then they would say, like, there's like, oh, like, don't worry about being nervous. Like, nervous is, like, it means you're about to be great. Like, you can do this. Like, Diane von Furstenberg always talks about, she's like, you're in charge. Like, you go. Like, you can do it. Like, someone who just believes in you, it's so valuable. And I think it's never one person. It really is a community. And I'm lucky because I think I've tried to always find people who, like, give me really valid feedback or constructive feedback, but fundamentally believe in me. And I think it's also one of the things, like my sister and I, we say it all the time, we have a duty to the next generation to mentor. Because the same way people helped us, we have to help others. And I think it's a real issue. Like Silicon Valley, like all of these different luminaries, like they have a responsibility to get out and to mentor people and to believe in people, to say positive things. So I look at like all of you, like, and it's like part of the reason why I love this whole concept in the village is I think it is, you can be successful, like so much of your success, like you can have your idea, you can have, there's luck, but then there is the community that makes you. And if I'd been surrounded by people who were like constantly telling me in the FDA is like, oh, you have to give up, it would have been really hard to push forward. But I was surrounded by people who were like, oh, you can do it. Like totally, like you go, like that's great. And I used to have the attitude, like I used to tell people in the company, I was like, look, other companies have to pay millions of dollars to get meetings with regulators. I was like, in our case, they came to us. And so there's a little bit of also how you spin everything. Like there's always a silver lining. So, and part of that comes from being surrounded by a community that fundamentally like helps you see the bright side or helps you see a solution. And so again, like I'm always really grateful I've been surrounded by such great people. And I think that's why, again, like this resonated with me of how important it is to be surrounded by other great people who are going to help you believe, like give you constructive feedback, and then going to believe in you. And if it's not this great idea, I always tell people in the building, like everyone's great at something. And you might not be great in this building, you might not be great in that role, but like you're always great at something. So you have to find that. And I think that's what like a village and a community helps you find that.
That's a perfect note to wrap up on. We're going to transition to a networking reception, but first, please give a huge round of applause for DJ and Anne. Thank you. If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.